As President Trump moves to reclassify marijuana under federal law while emphasizing it still remains illegal, how much difference will this change make? And what does the evidence really show about the drug's risks and possible medical uses?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's editorial pages, Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The Federal Controlled Substances Act has 5 classifications, and for years, marijuana has been in the top category, Schedule 1. This is for drugs, substances, or chemicals with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Other examples include LSD, ecstasy. Schedule 2, for the record, reading from the Drug Enforcement Administration's website, is for substances that have high potential of abuse, including cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone. Then there is Schedule 3, which is where Trump is now assigning an order to move marijuana. That is for drugs with moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence, including such things as Tylenol with codeine, anabolic steroids, and ketamine. Then below that are obviously Schedules 4 and 5. But let's listen to President Trump in the White House this week explaining what he's up to.
I want to emphasize that the order I am about to sign is not the legalization, or it doesn't legalize marijuana in any way, shape, or form, and in no way sanctions its use as a recreational drug. It has nothing to do with it. Just as the prescription painkillers may have legitimate uses, but can also do irreversible damage and never, if you look at some of the damage that can be caused, wreck lives, and if it's abused, it's never safe to use powerful controlled substances in recreational manners, and especially in this case, if you take a look, illegal and unregulated drugs, very, very bad thing.
Alicia, what do you make of what the president is doing here, and Schedule 1 versus Schedule 3, but still illegal under federal law? How much difference does that make in practical terms on the ground?
Well, the big practical effect on the ground is that it would allow marijuana growers and retailers to deduct expenses as if they were legitimate businesses, like drug companies. And that would provide about a $2 billion boost to these companies a year. And what do you think they're going to use that money on? Well, maybe they will reward their shareholders. And by the way, a lot of these companies are just big marijuana conglomerates. But they may just pump that money back into advertising to promote their products. They are selling this song and dance that, well, we need to reschedule marijuana so we can research that, which is absolutely hooey. Right now, there is nothing under the Controlled Substances Act that prevents companies from actually running trials to actually ascertain the effects, the benefits, or harms of these drugs. There is simply no incentive for them to do so because it's already allowed to be sold under state law without any kind of prescription or such. Now, you mentioned the difference between Schedule 1 and Schedule 3. Well, lowering it to Schedule 3 suggests that there really isn't one medical benefits, which actually has not been proven. Most evidence suggests that there actually aren't any medical benefits, and it can actually exacerbate conditions like depression and anxiety, the conditions that they are commonly used for. Not only that, there is a high risk for abuse, which is the definition of Schedule 1 drug. And the way you know that is that over 1/3 of people who use cannabis develop an addiction, and that means the withdrawals. They have withdrawal symptoms if they don't use it. They withdraw from society, and they become dependent on the drug. You don't see that as much, by the way, with other Schedule 3 drugs or alcohol, which the pot industry frequently compares marijuana to.
On the point about medical benefits, or at least claimed medical benefits, Kim, a recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association published last month. This is the conclusion. Evidence is insufficient for the use of cannabis or cannabinoids for most medical indications. Clear guidance from clinicians is essential to support safe, evidence-based decision-making. And on the other hand, I do think there is some evidence, growing evidence maybe, that there are significant risks. And in particular, it's worth keeping in mind that the marijuana that we're talking about now is not the same thing that the hippies had back in the 1960s. And so that is it's worth bearing in mind that when you see other headlines about particularly how many of these users are daily habitual users.
Your point about how the product has changed, I think, is incredibly important, because a lot of people just categorize this, as you said, as the kind of, hey, let's all chill out 1960s. Weed today is about 4 to 5 times more potent than it was even in the 1990s. And what we're finding is a lot of evidence now coming in about the dangers and the risk of dependency, how they increase with potency. And also, I think to that point that Alicia made, that this is not, as the industry likes to suggest all the time, oh, it's no different than alcohol, we should just put it in the same category. A study this year found that about 40% of car drivers who died in accidents in one Ohio county tested positive for THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. And what we're finding from some of these studies is that cannabis soaks into your brain in a way that alcohol does not. And it has longer term health impacts. It affects the parts of the brain that are responsible for memory and learning and attention and decision making and coordination. We're finding some incredibly concerning medical evidence that this is heightened in adolescence. There's medical imaging showing that it reduces gray matter in areas that are involved with impulse control and decision making. And that's even more concerning because we're also, finding out a lot more that it causes psychotic symptoms, especially at those higher potency levels. So we need to get our heads around this. Right now it's concerning. We've kind of had these two tracks where the federal government classifies this as a very dangerous drug, but we now have 40 states that allow it either for medicinal or for recreational purposes. And the use of it has galloped ahead of our knowledge of what this currently very potent marijuana is doing to health across the country. And it ought to be an imperative that we are trying to catch up on that and factoring that into decisions about use.
On the point about daily use, there were some headlines last year that the U.S. now has an estimated 17.7 million people who reported using marijuana daily or near daily, compared with 14.7 million daily or near daily drinkers as of 2022. Going a little bit deeper into that study, I thought this was interesting. Far more people drink, it says. This is from the study in the journal Addiction, but high-frequency drinking is less common in 2022. The median drinker reported on average 4 to 5 days in the past month versus 15 to 16 days in the past month for cannabis. And then, Alicia, you hear also stories about people who are chronic users of marijuana going into emergency rooms. A new sort of thing called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, sometimes referred to as scromiting, which is a portmanteau of screaming and vomiting. This is from a CNN report in 2021, quoting an emergency room doctor. He says they are writhing, holding their stomach, complaining of really bad abdominal pain and nausea. They vomit, and then they just continue to vomit whatever they have in their stomach, which can go on for hours. He goes on to say that's when we know we may have a case of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS. And so, Alicia, you also see stories on the point that Kim made about studies of toxicology on people who were in car accidents. You've seen that kind of being played out in these states. Colorado being one of the first that have gone all the way with full recreational legalization.
Right. It seems like almost every day I come across a study on the harms of marijuana. I mean, you mentioned the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, and you also mentioned scromding, cyclical vomiting that's often associated with nausea or stomach pain, and which, by the way, isn't very easy to treat. You just have to kind of let the marijuana wash through, or not necessarily wash, because it actually does soak into your brain. But it just requires time and actually people to stop using marijuana to actually get over this. Now, what happened, interestingly enough, during the pandemic, when everything shut down, people seemed to start using weed more, and ER visits for this, disorder increased nearly eightfold in the spring of 2020 as the COVID lockdowns took effect. Now they dropped somewhat as the COVID lockdowns eased and people returned to work, but they still are about 5 times higher than they were before the pandemic. And not surprisingly, the states in the Northeast and West, where you had where pot is more available, and where more states have legalized it for recreational use, and these states, by the way, also imposed stricter lockdowns, you saw bigger spikes in these ER visits. States have also increasingly seen more young people coming to the ER with psychotic and psychiatric symptoms that appear to be related to their cannabis use. In Massachusetts, which was one of the first or earlier states, at least, to legalize marijuana for recreational consumption. There was a recent study from doctors at the Mass General Brigham Hospital that found that the share of adolescents with psychiatric emergencies who also tested positive for THC jumped about 4-fold after the drug was legalized for recreational sale. You've seen similar studies in Canada and in the Netherlands, showing a pretty strong link between schizophrenic and psychotic symptoms and marijuana use. And just to hammer home the point Kim made, that's in part because the weed that is being sold today is so much more potent than it was. And it's actually, these states that claim they're regulating marijuana, well, they really aren't. It's not regulated like the FDA regulates drugs, in which they go around and inspect factories. It's basically a trust and don't verify system. They can sell marijuana at whatever potencies they want, and many of their products have much higher potencies than they even claim, or it's been found. In fact, many of their products are also contaminated with hard metals and pesticides they found, which is ironic because a lot of the pot industry says, "Oh, it's all natural, it's all good." Well, no, mushrooms and hemlock and there are other things that are all natural, but they're not good for you. And so what we're really seeing is, as the potency of pot increases, as more states legalize it and make it more available, we're seeing more and more of its harms.
But we do have kind of a tricky federalism issue here, Kim, because states have been moving to legalize recreational marijuana. About a decade and a half ago that began, and we now have 24 states that have done so, mostly blue ones, but some red ones, Ohio, Montana, and more than half of the population now lives in a state where recreational marijuana is allowed, even though it is still illegal under federal law. And the United States government has made clear over more than one presidential administration that they're going to kind of quietly acquiesce in this experiment. And so it does put the president in a difficult position. I mean, I guess he could decide to start sending, DEA agents and doing raids on these sort of facilities, these users. That would be very unpopular, I imagine, in those states. I don't think the federal government has ever really taken its enforcement initiatives off against cartels and big outfits that are doing this at scale. But it's a difficult issue now that the United States has kind of let this industry grow up in half of states almost.
Yeah, this is a big frustration of mine. And I think it's one of the problems of the messaging of this from the Trump administration. What the president said there in that clip we had is an example of sort of talking out of two sides of your mouth. You're lower classifying this. And then he's saying, but, we're not saying that means you should just use this stuff. This is an administration that claims to believe in law and order. And look, it is not the first to turn a blind eye to what's been going on out in the States. He inherited this. This goes back many, many administrations where they just decided they were going they firstly winked at its use for medicinal purposes under the guise that, this might have some benefit if doctors were prescribing it, et cetera. And that's just become a free for all. And we now have this complete conflict between states that are openly allowing people to go out and begin a pot shot on every corner, and a federal law that still claims that is absolutely illegal. And I would note, just to be very clear, that this rescheduling does not in any way make it legal, at least from the federal government's views. Personally, if I were in that business and I were a business owner, it would be kind of an insecure position to be in, because there's no telling there might not be another president, the next president, who comes in and just says, like, we're bringing the whip down. Like, I mean, and there's a listing right there in the phone book of every single target they need to go get in every single state. One more thing that I should note, just to be clear, this executive order does not automatically reschedule marijuana. Instead, it directs the Attorney General to complete a rulemaking process in an expeditious fashion. And once that rule is issued, there'll be a public comment period. And then you can be certain the lawsuits will then roll. They'll come in from opponents. And that's going to be interesting because it's going to maybe involve the courts in this. And this really interesting question about the conflict and the existence of federal law, which brings me back to my age-old hobby horse. There is one body out there that could actually sort all of this out if they decided to get serious and update their laws, and that would be Congress. And of course, they're not doing that.
Alicia, what do you think is going on here, though, given the president's rhetoric? I mean, you heard him in that clip saying, there are still risks. I'm not urging people to go out and do this. I mean, is this just now that there's half of states that have allowed it, now that there's a voting constituency for it? And let me also ask, your column this week is on the kind of contradictions of the Trump administration's health policy under the headline, does MAHA stand for Make America High Again? And it does strike me as a good point. You have RFK Jr., the health secretary, who is going after processed foods and food dyes and Tylenol, despite, a lack of real evidence. It seems to me that Tylenol is a risk to pregnant women above and beyond the risk posed by having a fever that goes untreated. And it's odd then seeing the administration move to ease the regulation of marijuana at the same time.
Right. I mean, it's hard to keep track of all these contradictions. And I'd also point out what we didn't discuss before is that, by the way, marijuana also increases the risk of heart attacks and strokes about 6-fold and 4-fold for strokes. Now, could actually be worse for you than a lot of the ultra processed foods that they target. The other contradiction that you alluded to is that marijuana is not an FDA approved drug. I mean, it has been a form of marijuana. Cannabis has been approved for what is essentially wasting syndrome, basically patients who have no appetite or lose their appetite from HIV. And so, marijuana brings on the munchies. And so a form or at a much lower dose or potency than is being sold recreational has been approved for that. But it's never gone through these large-scale randomized controlled trials that the FDA has demanded for other drugs. And the FDA is actually increasing its standards and making it harder to approve cancer therapies and vaccines, while basically giving, as Kim points, and making it a free-for-all for marijuana manufacturers and producers. Now, why is the president doing this? Well, One reason is, and I think it's the Occam's razor, is that he thinks it's popular among young people, and he has been losing support among them because, well, his economic policies, and young people are frustrated that costs continue to increase, and they're not getting ahead. And well, he cited a poll, which I'm very suspicious of, that marijuana rescheduling is supported by 82% of people. Well, even if that were true, I think it's because they haven't or listened to the other side of the argument, and they don't really understand what its effects will be. And so I think this is really a play for the Joe Rogan bro crowd. I mean, Biden tried to get young people by waiving away student loans, and now Trump is by essentially signaling to young people that, oh, marijuana is cool. Like I basically embracing the marijuana culture. And I think this is just a terribly destructive move that's going to have enormous consequences for society and public health.
Kim, the question of the reclassification and this federalism issue aside, that is also what gets me, is this almost valorization of it in some quarters, mostly on the left, but I think not exclusively. It seems like every April 20th, there will be Democratic politicians on Twitter making 420 jokes, and it's the same people who would crack down on tobacco companies in a hot minute if they thought tobacco companies were getting out of line. And so it is it's strange to me that we have so many of these leaders who are talking out of both sides of their mouth on this issue when marijuana smoke does similar things to your lungs as tobacco smoke.
Yes, of course. And it's absolutely incompatible. And we need to talk about, other things too. Alongside that has been this resurgence because, by the way, marijuana, once you open those doors and it becomes a free for all, you're sending a message to young kids. We're seeing, this incredible rise in vaping among younger Americans. Cigarettes are coming back again. There's a generalized attitude. And that's, by the way, before you actually look at other recreational drugs. Recreational drug use in this country, especially among the younger generation, is really quite extraordinary. And it is becoming a plague of that because of the health effects that Alicia had noted, but also the broader cultural effects. And I think that's one more really problematic contradiction for this administration. I look at the vice president, J.D. Vance, and he likes to talk about how government needs to be a molder of character. This is a man who, wrote a very famous book talking about deadbeat communities and the problem of these kind of left behind areas. A lot of times, those are also filled with younger men who are taking marijuana. I can speak from knowledge. I live in an area with a lot of blue collar industry. And there are a lot of young men who cannot get jobs, even though they are right and left good paying, solid jobs, especially in the trades, things like working as linemen, working in oil industry, because you got to take a drug test. And you can't pass it if you are habitually using marijuana. And so you are disqualified for some of the best paying jobs that are out there. How does that affect families? How does that affect prospects for marriage within marriages, among young couples in particular? We're talking about psychotic events here and unstable behavior. What's that doing to kids that are in the home? There are a lot of aspects of this that really I think we need to be having a broader public conversation on. And what I would like to be seeing is an administration that we're having those kind of conversations, making those kind of warnings to people, at least getting the correct information out instead of going along with, as you noted, what is mostly an issue on the left, but it's got pockets of Republican cool, or the Joe Rogan crowd that this administration seems so eager and keen to get a public approval from, but it's taking us in a very concerning direction.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.